This is Aqua Diary, an exploration of lakes, drinking water, water policy, environmental shifts, and the mysteries that live beneath the surface. I'm Allie, I'm an environmental scientist, and each week we'll look at what's happening with our water, from headlines to hidden science, to the strange stories lakes have carried for generations. Because water isn't just a resource, it's a system, it has a story to tell, and it affects all of us. This is Aqua Diary. On the morning of August 2nd, 2014, nearly 500,000 people in Toledo, Ohio, woke up and turned on their taps and could not use their water. Not to drink, not to cook with, not even to brush their teeth. Within hours, store shelves were stripped bare of bottled water. 350 National Guard troops were activated, and a state of emergency was declared. The cause wasn't a chemical spill, a pipeline failure, or some act of sabotage. It was algae. Specifically, a toxic cyanobacterial bloom, a massive spreading mat of blue-green microorganisms that had taken over the western basin of Lake Erie and crept directly into the city's drinking water intake. The toxin it produced, a compound called microcystin, had breached the treatment plant at 3.19 micrograms per liter, more than 3 times the World Health Organization's safety threshold of 1. The do not drink advisory lasted about 2.5 days. 60 people showed up at one Toledo hospital on the very first day alone with gastrointestinal symptoms. It was the first time in United States history that a toxic algal bloom had made tap water unsafe to drink in a major American city. The crisis cost Toledo an estimated $65 million in response and emergency measures. And the decades since, the city invested $500 million in treatment technology upgrades, trying to make sure it never happened again. And here's the part that should stop you cold. Nobody was even surprised it happened. Blooms had been forming in Lake Erie every summer for over a decade. Charter boat captains navigated through them, researchers monitored them, water managers feared them. The bloom that shut down Toledo's water supply didn't appear out of nowhere. It was an inevitable result of years of nutrient pollution and warming water, and a system pushed past its limits. 10 years later, the blooms are still coming back. The water coming out of the tap is safe now, but people often still can't swim in it or fish from it the way that they used to. The lake that 500,000 people depend on for their drinking water is still, every single summer, at risk and turning green. Today we're going to talk about what a bloom actually is, why it happens, and why, despite everything we know and everything that we've spent, it keeps getting worse. I am going to share some new and upcoming scientific research, so this is going to be a science-heavy topic, but it's also a widely requested one that I've received. So I'm going to give you everything that I have and break it down in plain English as much as possible. But I also want to tell you why this topic is really personal to me. Blooms are just not something that I read about, they're what I work with. Every single day I'm looking at bloom data. I'm managing projects on lakes that are actively experiencing them, and I'm trying to help communities understand what's happening to their water. I've seen them in lakes and work with lakes all over the country and even in other parts of the world. Algae blooms are also part of why I became a scientist to begin with, to understand why they were happening in my own drinking water source, Owasco Lake, and what I could do to protect the lake and the community that raised me. And the thing that strikes me every single time after all these years is how preventable so much of this is, and how few people understand what they're actually looking at or why it's happening to begin with. So that's what today's about. I want you to have a scientist level understanding of why exactly this is happening and what the science says, so you can speak up to the people who can make changes in your community. All of the research that I'm talking about is pretty much locked behind paywalls that I have access to as a scientist, but you don't, and you ought to know those details too. So I'll do the best I can to explain. When most people hear the word algae, they picture the green slippery stuff on a rock, like at the edge of a lake. And that is algae. But what takes over a lake during a bloom is something completely different and something very, very old. Cyanobacteria, sometimes called blue-green algae, are actually not algae at all. They're a bacteria. Single-celled microorganisms that have no nucleus, no complex internal structure, just ancient, stripped-down biological machinery that has been doing the same thing for somewhere between 2 and 3.5 billion years. Let that land for a second. The oldest confirmed cyanobacterial fossils are approximately 2.1 billion years old. Some fossil evidence pushes that back even further, potentially to 3.5 billion years, making them among the oldest life forms ever identified on this planet. They were here before most complex animals, before plants, before the oxygen was in the atmosphere that we breathe. In fact, cyanobacteria are the reason that we have oxygen in our atmosphere. They pretty much invented the process of converting sunlight and carbon dioxide into oxygen. So the air that you're breathing right now exists largely because of cyanobacteria. We need them, and they serve a really important function. But right now, we've got one too many. And our lakes are turning green, and they're shutting down our drinking water systems. So what makes them so successful? Oh, there's a few things. First, they, photosynthesize like a plant does, converting sunlight into energy. But unlike most other microscopic organisms in the lake, the ones that drift with the current and can't control where they go, a lot of cyanobacteria can regulate their buoyancy and their position in the water column. They have these internal gas bubbles that let them move around whenever they want and wherever they want. They also reproduce really fast. Their life cycles are super short, which means they can evolve and adapt to changing conditions faster than almost anything else. And third, this is the part that matters the most for understanding why blooms are getting worse, I think. They thrive in exactly the conditions that we are creating. Warm water, nutrient-rich water, still water with plenty of sunlight. Climate change and nutrient pollution aren't just bad for lakes in a general sense. They're specifically, almost precisely, the conditions that cyanobacteria have been waiting for. There's still a lot we don't understand about them, which is a consideration to keep in the back of your mind, too. Now, one thing about their color. You've probably heard them called blue-green algae, and that name comes from a pigment that they carry called phycocyanin. Phyco meaning algae and cyan meaning blue-green. It's the same pigment family that gives some of them that distinctive turquoise or teal color when they concentrate on the surface of the water. But cyanobacteria actually can come in a ton of range of colors, depending on the species and conditions. Phycocyanin is also the pigment that researchers can use to detect and measure algae blooms from space using satellites. When water managers are monitoring a lake from space, which I do sometimes, phycocyanin concentrations are one of the primary signals that we're looking for. The question is, what do they need? What turns a lake from a healthy one into some weird toxic green soup that we can't swim in or drink from? The answer starts with two words you've probably heard before: nutrients, specifically phosphorus and nitrogen. Phosphorus is what we really pay attention to in freshwater systems, and nitrogen is what we pay attention to in saltwater systems. I'm primarily going to be talking about freshwater harmful algal blooms. So phosphorus is the primary driver of bloom growth. So think of it as like a fuel. In a natural healthy lake, phosphorus is pretty scarce, and that scarcity is actually a good thing. It keeps algae growth in check. It's called a limiting nutrient, the thing that's the least available generally. Its lack of presence limits growth, hence the term limiting nutrient. But when there's a lot of phosphorus in a lake from fertilized lawns, that natural limit is no longer really a limit. The cyanobacteria have more fuel, and so they bloom. But nutrients alone don't tell the whole story. Cyanobacteria also need the right physical conditions, and this is where the structure of the lake becomes critically important. Some of you also asked me about stratification and turnover, and this is part of where I'm going to describe that. So a lot of lakes in temperate regions, the Finger Lakes and most lakes in the Northeast, stratify in the summer. That's a term worth understanding, especially for blooms. Stratification is what happens when a lake separates into distinct layers based on temperature. The surface water on top warms up in the sun and becomes lighter. The deeper water stays pretty cold and dense. And because warm water floats on cold water, those layers don't mix. The warm upper layer, the part you swim in, the part that catches the sun, that's called the epilimnion, epi for top. Below it, the water's pretty cold and it's dense. That's the hypolimnion, hypo for low. And the boundary between them, where the temperature starts to drop, if you've ever dove down deep into a lake and felt that cold ball hit you, that's probably the thermocline. You've probably felt the thermocline without knowing it even had a name. Picture it like a lake that has essentially become two separate water bodies stacked on top of each other with a sort of barrier between them. Now here's why it matters for blooms. Cyanobacteria love the epilimnion. It's warm and sunny, and thanks to their gas bubbles, they can position themselves right at the surface whenever the light is the best. While other algae struggle to stay in the right part of the water column, cyanobacteria can simply float around whenever and wherever. In a stratified lake in summer, they have an advantage over almost everything else. But stratification can do something else too. It cuts off the deeper water from oxygen supply, a condition called hypoxia, meaning dangerously low oxygen levels, or in really severe cases, anoxia, which means no oxygen at all. Think of it like the difference between a room that's running out of air and a room that has none left. And when the bottom water loses oxygen, something happens in the sediment that is at the heart of why blooms are so hard to stop, even if we eliminate the pollution coming into the lake from the outside. This brings us to one of the most important distinctions and things we should be talking about in lake science right now. The difference between external loading, stuff coming into the lake from the outside, and internal loading. So external loading is what most people think about when they think about lake pollution. It's all of the stuff coming in from the outside of the lake whenever it rains. It comes in through multiple pathways, and not all of them are obvious. The ones people often think about are stormwater runoff, streams, ditches. Ditches are a really underappreciated pathway. Drainage ditches that run alongside roads act as pretty much direct highways for nutrient and pollutant-laden water, moving it straight from the land and then straight to the lake with nothing to slow it down or filter it. There's some studies coming out of Cornell that are especially worth checking out on that topic. There was also a study on Oneida Lake right here in New York, led by Sol Lisboa, sorry if I'm mispronouncing, as part of her PhD research, and published with Rebecca Schneider and Lars Rudstam and Todd Walter. They found something that challenges the way we typically think about where nutrients are even coming from. Looking at where phosphorus was coming from during the summer months, they found that 30% entered through streams, as expected. 20% of phosphorus came from groundwater, directly seeping into the lake bed. And 50%, half of all of the summer phosphorus, came from the lake itself. That study matters because it expands where we have to look when we're trying to understand why a lake is struggling. It's not just the stormwater pipe that you can see, or the stream running off the land, or that neighbor that you're mad about, or even the farmer you're mad at. There's some nutrients moving invisibly through the ground and coming out of the lake itself. And it's a lot. Just from that study alone, that's about 70% of the nutrients in Oneida Lake, not even coming from outside, from kind of the inside. That brings us to one of the most underappreciated nutrient sources of all, the nutrients that come from the lake itself. So that's internal nutrient loading, and it's where the science gets complicated and really alarming once you start to understand it. Internal loading is what happens when phosphorus that has accumulated in the lake's own sediments gets released back into the water. Think of the lake sediment like a bank account. For decades, sometimes longer, nutrients have been making deposits. Every fertilizer application washed off a lawn, every sewage overflow, It all settles to the bottom of the lake and accumulates layer by layer, year after year. Under most conditions, that phosphorus stays locked up in the sediment, bound up, unavailable, essentially frozen in place. Algae can't use it. So the bank account exists, but nobody can really make a withdrawal. But when the deeper water loses oxygen, which is exactly what stratification can cause, that changes. The chemistry shifts. The lock opens, and the phosphorus is released directly back into the water where living organisms like algae can use it. Right there, inside the lake, no external pollution needed. The bank account starts paying out, and unlike a real bank account, there is no overdraft limit. This is what researchers are calling the legacy load. It's like the ghost of pollution past. A lake can still be experiencing blooms driven by phosphorus that entered the water 10, 20, or 30 years ago, long after the farm upstream changed its practices, long after the sewage pipe was fixed, and long after the community thought they had solved the problem. The source could be gone, but the pollution isn't. A 2025 paper by Dr. Gertrude Nurnberg, published in Lake and Reservoir Management, makes this case really compellingly. Even when communities can reduce these nutrient inputs, they clean up their stormwater, they reduce fertilizer use, they improve wastewater treatment, internal loading can be enough to sustain cyanobacterial blooms. The sediment just keeps feeding the bloom long after these outside sources have been addressed. And climate change is making it worse in ways that are only now starting to be understood, which we'll get to in a second. So what ends stratification? And what happens to all of that nutrient-rich, oxygen-depleted bottom water? In the Northeast, as the air temperatures start to cool off, the surface water also cools off and becomes denser. Eventually, it reaches a similar or the same temperature as the deep water, and the thermocline, or that barrier between them, isn't as strong. The lake eventually can mix from top to bottom. This is called turnover, and it happens every year in temperate lakes, often twice a year actually, once in spring and once in fall. Scientists actually have a name for lakes that mix twice a year. They're called dimictic lakes. Di meaning two and mictic meaning mixing. So if you want a word to impress somebody at a dinner party, that's your new word. Turnover can be a reset, but also kind of a reckoning. The oxygen from the upper water can return to the deeper water, and the lake essentially breathes again. But all of that phosphorus that accumulated in that deeper water over the summer, released from the sediment under no oxygen or low oxygen conditions, can get mixed throughout the whole water column, and it's now available to anything that wants to use it. And in many cases, what uses it? You can probably guess. Yep, cyanobacteria, sometimes appearing in October when people have long stopped worrying about water quality. They're still there. So we have cyanobacteria that are ancient, adaptable, perfectly suited to warm, nutrient-rich water. We have lakes accumulating decades of phosphorus in their sediments, releasing it from the inside, and a change in climate that is making every single one of these conditions worse at the same time. That's not a coincidence. It's called a feedback loop, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So let's start with temperature. As air temperatures rise, the water warms faster and earlier in the season. Warmer water means stronger and earlier stratification. The extreme between the temperature of the upper water and the temperature between the lower water is greater. They're more different, so they're separated and it's stronger stratification. And that stronger and earlier season stratification means that they stay separated for longer. A 2023 study led by Stephen Jane and colleagues analyzed data from more than 400 lakes across a temperate zone and found that more than 3/4 of those lakes showed an increase in the duration of seasonal stratification. 3/4. That means that the window of time when the deep water is cut off from oxygen, and therefore the window when internal phosphorus from the sediment is probably actively coming out. That process is getting longer every decade. It's happening more for a longer period of time. The study found that the proportion of deep water falling below critical oxygen thresholds has also been increasing by roughly 1 to 2% per decade. And that sounds small, but compounded over decades across hundreds of lakes, that represents a massive shift. And here's the climate feedback that the Nuremberg 2025 paper focused on specifically. And I think that's one of the most important and underappreciated dynamics in freshwater science right now. As stratification strengthens and lengthens, more phosphorus is released from the sediment. That phosphorus fertilizes and feeds cyanobacteria. The cyanobacteria bloom, die, then sink back to the bottom where they decompose and consume more oxygen in the process, which drives this cycle all over again, feeding more blooms. So the lake is essentially feeding the blooms by itself. Not only that, but the timing of the nutrient release now is shifting to when algae want to use it. And here's the part that should genuinely alarm anybody working in lake management or living near a lake that has been historically polluted if you're not scared yet. Nuremberg's paper makes it clear that internal loading can sustain harmful algal blooms, even when we reduce pollution going into the lake. The legacy nutrients, the accumulated phosphorus from decades of pollution, can keep fueling blooms on its own, and it is amplified by climate change. So this is the challenge that we are actually facing, that nobody is talking about. The only person I've heard talk about this in the lake management realm is me and these research papers. So that's why it's really important for me for you to hear this and for you to echo what these research papers are actually finding so we can manage blooms appropriately. We can't just focus on stopping pollution from entering lakes. It's important, but we can't just focus on that anymore. We have to figure out what to do about the pollution that's already there, sitting in the sediment, and being unlocked by these processes. And as a scientist, working primarily on this type of issue, this is really the thing that angers me the most, because so many lake managers, and even those in my hometown, deny this is happening when the research and the proof is literally right there. There are a few other climate mechanisms worth understanding. So we also have reduced ice cover. The lakes aren't freezing over anymore. And that can also change the phosphorus cycle in ways that we're still trying to understand. So ice cover historically kept lakes colder throughout the winter and limited some of this phosphorus release, but we don't really have that happening anymore. And we don't know how bad that is, but we do know it's a consideration. There's also this process called atmospheric stilling that I've only learned about in the past year. So the jet stream is dying. And similar to stratification, the jet stream is driven by the extreme difference in temperature between the equator and the poles, just like how stratification is driven by the extreme temperature difference between the upper warm water and the colder, deeper water. The difference in temperature between the poles and the equator is decreasing. They're not as different as they used to be, and that's slowing down the jet stream. And so that creates a lot of things that scientists are just conglomerating into the term atmospheric stilling. So it's a documented decrease in average wind speeds across the northern hemisphere, and it increases the lake stability and makes stratification last even longer. So less wind means less mixing. The wind can mix the water when it hits the water. And so it just means stronger stratification and greater potential for lower oxygen in the lake. And also when overall wind speeds drop, storms move more slowly, which is probably something you've already seen. Instead of passing through quickly, they stall and sit over the same area forever and dump far more rain in one rain event than they normally ever would have in the past. So that could mean one storm can deliver a massive pulse of runoff and nutrients all at once, more than the natural systems are used to and can really handle. So climate change is producing both calmer conditions and more intense individual storms. When a major storm hits a stratified lake, it can mix the water column and drive all of that phosphorus-rich water into the upper surface layer, essentially delivering a massive fertilizer pulse directly to cyanobacteria. A 2020 study in Global Change Biology found that a single storm event can dramatically shift the balance of life in a lake within days. And cyanobacteria, you guessed it, are almost always the ones that win. So we have warmer temperatures, extending stratification, reduced ice cover, potentially extending this internal loading scenario, atmospheric stilling, strengthening stratification, intense storms, mixing all of that sediment directly into the productive time periods for algae to be using it exactly when they want it. And every single one of those mechanisms work in the same direction, towards more blooms, towards more intense blooms, earlier in the season, later in the fall, in lakes that never even had them before, and in lakes that we thought were getting better. And that last point matters. The Harrison et al. 2025 paper studied Lake Eugenia in Ontario, what scientists call an oligotrophic lake, meaning a lake that is naturally low in nutrients and historically clear and clean. By every conventional measure, this lake should not be having serious bloom problems, and neither should Skinny Atlas Lake in New York. It's the kind of lake people move next to precisely because it seems pristine, and yet Lake Eugenia has experienced cyanobacterial blooms for decades, with residents reporting the conditions are getting worse. And the researchers found evidence of microcystis, which is the genus of cyanobacteria that produces the toxin microcystin. They found it actively growing in the deep water before it ever appeared at the surface. Using the hypolimnion, this lower water, is kind of an incubator, feeding on that internal loaded phosphorus before even choosing to rise to the mixed layer as a fully formed bloom. Think about that for a second. We historically thought that algae were only growing where the sunlight was, and maybe they'd occasionally go down, get their nutrients, and then come back up. Nope. They're down there. They're down there growing with hardly any sunlight. I've only read the abstract of this paper. I'd love to actually know why they're surviving down there in the dark. I could understand why they are using nutrients being released into the lake, but that is horrifying. If you're in lake management, you have to understand how horrifying that is. So this is the new picture of harmful algal blooms. It's a lot more complicated than you probably thought. It's not just a problem for polluted or over-fertilized lakes. It's a problem for all lakes, for pristine lakes, with no human activity surrounding or causing it. For lakes that communities have spent decades trying to protect, and the scary part? Cleaning up the pollution that's coming into the lake might not be enough to fix it. I want to be transparent with you. This is somewhat new information, but not really. The research has been building for years, and yet in my own career, in meetings, in reports and conversations with lake managers and local officials and decision makers, and even in my own hometown, affecting my own water supply, I have been talking about this over and over and over again. Internal loading is real, and it is probably happening everywhere. The legacy phosphorus is probably what is driving our blooms, even in lakes where the external pollution coming in has been reduced or even eliminated. We cannot manage our way out of this problem if we refuse to acknowledge what new science is actually telling us. We have to stop sticking our heads in the sand and blaming our neighbors for why blooms are happening. I was a watershed inspector around my home water supply, and I was out there seeing what was actually going into the lake. And this was a few years ago. I was stumped. I genuinely didn't understand why people were yelling at each other and watching blooms happen anyway. There were some serious seriously concerning things. Like I've said this in a different episode. You shouldn't be applying lawn fertilizer on shorefront property and then complaining when blooms happen. That's crazy behavior. You know, there were some genuine issues like that, or construction happening right on the shoreline and a ton of sediment running into the lake, which attaches itself to phosphorus, by the way. Phosphorus likes to stick itself to soil. So when you see soil going into the lake, there's probably a lot of phosphorus in there with it. But I'm ranting. So let's take a quick stock of where we are. I just want to tell you that some people aren't listening. A lot of people aren't. And lakes in the communities around it, and even I, in my own drinking water source, I'm paying for it. So this is part of why this podcast exists. Because if the professionals in the room won't hear it, maybe the public will. Maybe you will. And maybe you can help make them listen. So please help. Anyways, going back to the main topic here. Cyanobacteria are among the oldest organisms on the planet, right? They're perfectly engineered for the conditions that are going on right now. Warm water, still water, nutrients, and we are delivering all three in increasing quantities. They can feed on pollution that entered a lake decades ago. They can grow in lakes that appear clean. They can grow in the hypolimnia. And every major climate trend is pushing conditions further into their favor. That's a lot to sit with. And I want to be honest with you, there are no easy answers here. This isn't a problem you solve with one policy change or one infrastructure upgrade or one watershed improvement. It's not possible. And I think watershed improvements are important, but I don't think they're alone enough to fix this problem. Not when you start to look at the science like this. It's a systematic problem that requires understanding the whole picture. The watershed, the sediment, the climate, the infrastructure, the choices being made on the land around every lake. But here's also what I know after years of working with these systems. Understanding is the first step to action. And most people, most communities, don't yet have the full picture. They see green water and are scared, and they don't know what's in it. They don't know where it comes from. They don't know that their drinking water treatment plant is working overtime every single summer to keep that toxin out of their tap, and sometimes they're scared too. But now you understand. And I really hope that you take this information and run with it to help improve the water quality from and where you live. I hope you echo some of these concerns. I hope you just start to say the word internal loading. I hope you go to some of these meetings and share these papers with people and share these ideas with researchers. So please, I don't want our lakes to die and it's starting to feel futile. I've worked in this industry for a very long time. I've worked in water quality for a very long time, and I am kind of scared too. I feel like we are running out of time to fix this problem. And I think it's important for us to be preventing pollution coming into the lake 100%. But I don't think that's the full answer here. And there are no silver bullet solutions for any environmental crises. So keep that in mind too, please, before blaming your neighbor for causing the blooms. They're not. So the next episode, I realize this has to be 2 episodes here because I don't want to put out an hour and a half long episode. I'm going to talk about what happens once the blooms get into your drinking water. I think that's a really important concept to make sure that we go over. So what microcystin, the main toxin that you're going to hear about in news articles, what that does to the human body, how drinking water treatment plants try to remove it, and where that process has limits, what the safety thresholds actually are for like consumptions, and how close some communities have come to exceeding them, and what's being done and what isn't to address the problem at the source. So I'm Allie. This is Aqua Diary. Please comment and rate this podcast. If you rate this podcast, then it'll be shown to more people and it could potentially help more people. So please share, comment, follow, subscribe wherever you are. I appreciate you and thank you so much for inspiring me to speak on this topic. I hope it's been insightful.